At Christmas Eve dinner, I received a divorce paper instead of a gift. The red envelope sat on the table between the roast and the mashed potatoes, shining brighter than the golden candles. My husband slid it toward me with the same hand he used to pass the salt casual and cold. I thought it was jewelry, maybe earrings, maybe a necklace to remind me of when we were young and foolish. Instead, inside was the signature that ended 40 years of my life. I hear the scrape of forks stopping midair. My son's hand stiffens around his glass. My daughter blinks at her father like she's seeing him for the first time. Even the children, my grandchildren, with their sticky hands and Christmas sweaters fall silent, watching me open the envelope. For a moment, I imagine they think it's money or tickets to a family trip. The kind of surprise that makes everyone clap. But it isn't. It's betrayal, notarized and numbered black ink on cream paper. The roast smells of rosemary, but I can't swallow. My mouth tastes like iron. I feel my pulse in my temples. All I hear is the ticking of the old clock on the wall, steady as a judge's gavel. My husband leans back in his chair, satisfied. He doesn't need to say anything. His gift is silence. His weapon is the public display. He wanted humiliation, and here it is. I look down at the papers, the heading clear, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. Legal words where love should have been. My name sits printed at the top, but it feels like it belongs to someone else. Eleanor Marie Thompson, 60 years old, wife, mother, grandmother, and now discarded. My fork clatters onto the china plate. The sound is louder than it should be, breaking the spell of the moment. My son mutters, "Dad, what the hell is this?" My daughter inhales sharply, pressing her napkin against her lips as if to hold back words, or maybe to keep her dinner down. The children shift in their seats, confused, sensing the adult's fear. The tree glows in this corner, ornaments catching firelight. The stockings hang neatly above the mantel. Everything looks so normal, so perfect, except for the envelope lying open on the table. I want to fold it back up to tuck it away to pretend this isn't happening. But the letters won't disappear. My husband made sure of that. I think back to the morning when I ironed the tablecloth, polished the silverware, and tied ribbons around the napkins. I had baked the pecan pie myself, even though my wrists ache now when I knead dough. I wanted one last Christmas to feel whole, and instead, he chose this day to tell me I was no longer wanted. Not in private, not gently, not with respect. But here in front of the family, I carried the family I built with my own hands. My cheeks burn, but I force my eyes up. I won't cry, not now. He wants me broken in front of them, wants me humiliated. I won't give him that satisfaction. My daughter whispers, "Mom," but her voice trails away, uncertain, already choosing sides. My son looks like he might leap across the table. He doesn't. Nobody moves. I push my chair back. The sound of wood against tile cuts through the silence. I pick up the papers and feel their weight. He planned this. You can't file a divorce overnight. He had lawyers meeting strategy. And all the while, I was making grocery lists, setting the table, asking which pie everyone wanted. I was preparing a holiday. He was preparing an execution. I stand there for what feels like hours, though it must be seconds. My knees tremble, but my voice comes out steady. Merry Christmas. It's all I say. Then I leave the table, papers clutched in my hand, heart pounding like it might burst through my chest. In the kitchen, the air feels colder. The dishwasher hums softly, oblivious. I grip the counter, the granite biting into my palms. The voices from the dining room blur together. Anger, confusion, disbelief. I hear my son shouting, my daughter crying, my husband's low voice trying to control the chaos. I know this sound. It's the sound of something breaking, something that will never be repaired. I walk to the back doorstep onto the porch. Snow falls softly, dusting the railing, covering the world in silence. I stand barefoot on the cold wood, my breath rising in clouds. Inside, Christmas is ending. Out here, I feel the first sting of freedom. Not yet peace, not yet relief, but the smallest hint that maybe one day this wound will not define me. I clutch the papers tighter, the ink smudging under my fingers. The envelope smells of toner and betrayal. The porch light flickers. The tree still glows behind the window. My family sits in silence, and I stand outside, half frozen, half alive, knowing that nothing will ever be the same again. The voices in the dining room rose and fell behind me that night, muffled by walls that had once held laughter. I didn't go back. I stood on the porch until the cold gnawed through my bones, until my feet were numb against the boards. The divorce papers weighed heavy in my hand, heavier than the turkey I had basted all day. Heavier than the years I had carried him through promotions, relocations, and betrayals spoken only in silence. Eventually, I walked to the bedroom, locked the door, and let the envelope sit on the nightstand like a predator watching me sleep. The next morning, Christmas morning, the house smelled of cinnamon rolls, but no one came to the kitchen. My son had left in the night, slamming the door so hard a wreath fell from the wall. My daughter stayed, but she moved like a ghost, torn between loyalty to me and her need to believe her father wasn't cruel. The grandchildren were restless, asking questions she couldn't answer. I heard her telling them Santa was tired this year. That lie was softer than the truth. When I finally emerged, my husband was already gone. He left a note on the fridge that said only, "We'll discuss terms after the holidays," as if our marriage were a business contract and not a life built in burnt pies, midnight fevers, and car rides to soccer games. The callousness of those words etched themselves into my chest, a scar I would trace for months to come. I tried to clean up the table. The plates were still sticky, the gravy had hardened, the roast sat untouched. I moved slowly, careful not to let my hands shake. But when I reached the red envelope lying crooked on the table, rage surged through me. I wanted to tear it to pieces. Instead, I slipped it back inside its neat sleeve. If he thought he would define me with this paper, I would hold it like evidence. I would not destroy it. Memories began unspooling against my will. I saw myself at 22 slipping into a courthouse wedding dress that wasn't really white but ivory because we couldn't afford real satin. I saw his grin when he promised me forever, the grin that convinced me to drop out of college when his job required us to move. "We'll finish your degree later," he had said, his hands on mine. "Right now, let's build our family." Later never came. I remembered the nights I stayed up with sick babies while he traveled for conferences. I remembered balancing the checkbook while clipping coupons, stretching every dollar so he could invest in his retirement account. I remembered canceling my art classes when his promotion demanded another move across the country. Each sacrifice had seemed small at the time, a thread pulled for the good of the whole. But now, with papers on the table, I saw how much of the tapestry of my life had unraveled. In the afternoon, my daughter came to the kitchen, her face blotchy from crying. "Mom," she said softly, "he said he couldn't keep living like this." Her words cut deeper than the papers. "Like this? Like what?" Like a woman who ironed his shirts, cooked his meals, remembered birthdays, and loved him long after he stopped loving her. I bit back the scream rising in my throat. Instead, I washed another dish, the water scalding my hands. She touched my arm. Maybe he's just confused. No, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He's not confused. He planned this. I lifted the envelope. This didn't print itself last night. He wanted to deliver it here at this table with all of you watching. Her eyes dropped. She didn't argue. She didn't have to. We both knew the truth. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit the signs had been there. The late nights at the office, the way he stopped asking me to travel with him, the distance in bed, the conversations that turned into silence. I had convinced myself marriage was ebb and flow, that his coldness was temporary. But as I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, I realized I had been alone for years, carrying the weight of a partnership by myself. The following week, neighbors dropped by with leftovers and polite smiles. We heard the kids fighting. One whispered, "Is everything all right?" I nodded, too ashamed to tell them the truth. In a town like ours, gossip moved faster than snowmelt. Still, I imagined their dinner tables, their hushed conversations. Eleanor's husband left her on Christmas Eve. The humiliation was public now, exactly as he wanted. I avoided church that Sunday. I couldn't bear the pitying looks, the hollow sympathy. Instead, I walked the empty streets, snow crunching beneath my boots, and thought of the years I had surrendered. My art supplies gathering dust in the attic, my journals half-filled, abandoned when children needed lunches packed. The promises he made that I tucked away like ornaments in a box, too fragile to bring out again. That evening, when I returned home, the house was dark. My daughter had taken the children to her place. My son hadn't called. The silence pressed against me, suffocating. I lit a single candle and sat at the table where the envelope had first appeared. The flame wavered, casting shadows against the walls. I picked up the papers and read them line by line. Legal phrases, petitioner-respondent, dissolution, equitable distribution. Cold words for a warm life. When I reached the section on property, I laughed bitterly. He listed the house, the accounts, the pension. He listed everything but me, as though I were invisible, as though 40 years of my care and compromise held no value. That night, something hardened inside me. The humiliation was his gift, but survival would be mine. I folded the papers, neatly slid them back into the red envelope, and placed it on the mantel beneath the stockings. A new kind of decoration. A reminder. I would not forget, and I would not forgive. The tree still glowed in the corner. The candy canes hung untouched. The stockings sagged with gifts no one had opened. I sat at the table, hands resting flat, and whispered into the silence, "I gave you everything, and you gave me this." The house didn't answer, but inside the stillness, I felt the first crack of something breaking free. Not relief, not peace, but the beginning of a reckoning I hadn't allowed myself to imagine until now. The paper on the mantel gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Evidence. Weapon. Or maybe someday a key. I sat alone in the kitchen a few days after Christmas, staring at the envelope propped on the mantel. It was absurd how that slip of paper had more presence in my house than the tree itself. The lights blinked dutifully, but they no longer glowed for me. I kept circling back to the question, how did I get here? The answer came not in a single memory, but in a stream of sacrifices, each one small enough to ignore at the time, yet together heavy enough to bury me. I was 20 years old when he asked me to marry him. I still had 2 semesters left before finishing my English degree. I remember holding the ring, a modest one he'd saved for, with his first steady paycheck, and hearing him say, "We can make a life together. School will always be there." He smiled in that way that made me believe him. School would wait, life couldn't. So I left campus, turned in my textbooks, and packed my things to start our marriage in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. At first, I told myself I was happy. I loved cooking meals on the 2-burner stove, making curtains out of thrift store fabric, listening to him talk about his job at the bank. When we found out I was pregnant, he glowed with pride while I put my body through 9 months of exhaustion. After the baby came, I tried to return to part-time classes, but between diapers, colic, and late-night feedings, it became impossible. One day, I simply stopped showing up. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary stretched into decades. I can still see the photograph of me holding our first child, a son, in a rocking chair. I looked so young with tired eyes, but a soft smile. I remember thinking, this is worth it. Missing classes, missing sleep, missing the sense that I had a future of my own. It was worth it for family. But family became a word that always seemed to lean more heavily on me than him. He rose through the bank, earning promotions that moved us from city to city. Each time I packed the boxes called the utilities, enrolled the children in new schools. He called it adventure. I called it starting over again and again without roots. I dreamed of stability, of finishing my degree, of maybe teaching one day. Instead, I ironed his shirts and kept our children's medical records in neat binders, my handwriting, the invisible scaffolding of his success. By the time our daughter arrived, I had stopped speaking about college. Whenever I mentioned it, he would kiss my cheek and say, "You're the heart of this family. Why do you want to leave it?" I didn't want to leave it. I wanted to grow inside it. But my needs were treated like a threat. So I tucked them away like old letters in a drawer until even I forgot they existed. The holidays were always my stage, though. Thanksgiving dinners, birthday cakes, 4th of July barbecues, I made them sparkle. It was my way of proving I mattered, even if no one said it out loud. And Christmas was the crown jewel. I spent weeks decorating, baking, creating traditions that my children would remember long after toys broke and clothes wore out. I thought he saw me in those moments, bustling in the kitchen, arranging stockings, humming carols, as if joy could be baked into cookies. Now I know he saw convenience, a wife who made his life look full. The night after Christmas, I dug through an old box in the attic. I found a faded notebook from my college years, pages yellowed, handwriting small and hurried, poems, fragments of essays, reflections I once believed mattered. I sat cross-legged among dusty ornaments and read my 20-year-old self's words. She wanted to be a writer. She wanted to speak her mind. She wanted to matter for her own voice, not only for who she fed and clothed. I felt a sting in my chest, grief for the girl I abandoned. As I read, the sound of laughter from downstairs startled me. My daughter had put on a movie for the grandchildren, trying to restore some normalcy. The sound should have comforted me, but it only underlined the truth I had poured myself into family, and still the man I built it for handed me papers instead of thanks. That night, I remembered another moment. He had returned late from work, suit jacket slung over his arms, smelling of bourbon. Our son had a school concert, and I had begged him to be there. "Next time," he said, loosening his tie. I cried in the kitchen, the music still echoing in my ears from the auditorium. He touched my shoulder and said, "Don't be dramatic. They won't remember if I miss one." But they did. I did. The absence became a pattern his excuses rehearsed while I filled every void. The sacrifices stacked high, invisible bricks that walled me off from myself. By the time the children were grown, I didn't even know what my dreams were anymore. My life was measured in meals, cooked moves, managed crises, endured. I thought loyalty would be repaid with loyalty. I thought endurance meant security. I was wrong. The red envelope sat on the mantel, still glowing in the firelight. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. It mocked me 40 years of compromise reduced to a stack of legal jargon. My sacrifice hadn't been invisible to him, it had been convenient. And when it no longer served, he discarded me like a contract expired. I pressed my forehead against the cool window pane, snowflakes swirling outside. My reflection looked back lined, weary, but still standing. That was the cruelest truth of all. I had given him my strength, and I still had some left. Perhaps that was the one thing he hadn't counted on. The house settled into quiet, the kind that feels permanent. I folded the old notebook closed and brought it downstairs. I placed it beside the envelope on the mantel, past self and present self side by side. One silenced, one awakening. I whispered into the dark, I gave up myself for this family. The words trembled in the air. But then I added steadier, I won't give up myself again. The tree lights blinked as if in answer, soft and unrelenting. The papers waited, and for the first time, I felt something stir that wasn't shame. It was anger, quiet, focused, alive. The days blurred after Christmas, each one gray and heavy. I moved through the house as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome, tiptoeing around memories that clung to the walls. The mantel still displayed the red envelope and my old college notebook. Together, they looked like artifacts from two different lives, the girl who dreamed and the woman discarded. I tried to busy myself. I took down the garland, folded the stockings, packed ornaments into their boxes. Yet every time my hand brushed against the pine needles of the tree, I felt a sting in my chest. The decorations I once hung with joy had become accusations. You gave him everything. He gave you nothing. The truth echoed through the empty rooms. At night, the silence became unbearable. I found myself turning on the television just to hear voices. But even that failed me, because every commercial, every sitcom laugh track reminded me of families intact, scripted in harmony. Mine was fractured, and beneath the humiliation, another truth began to rise like a tide. Maybe it had been broken long before that night. I remembered an afternoon years ago when I came home from grocery shopping and found a strange number scribbled on a slip of paper by the phone. I had asked him about it, my voice tentative. He had smiled, patted my cheek, and said, "Don't be paranoid." I wanted to believe him, so I did. But the unease never left. It lingered like a shadow one I pushed aside, because confronting it might have meant losing the little stability I clung to. Now, with the envelope as evidence, I wondered if that moment had been the first betrayal. The realization grew in small details. The way he used to take business calls in another room. The way he traveled more often as the children grew older. The way he stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped noticing when I cut my hair, stopped asking me to sit beside him at church. None of it had seemed fatal at the time. Together, though, the fragments formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. He had been leaving me piece by piece long before the papers arrived. One morning, my son called. His voice was taut with anger. "Mom, I don't know how you're standing it. If it were me, I'd burn his damn office down." I almost smiled at his fire. "I'm standing because I have to," I said. "Because you and your sister need me steady." He sighed. "She's still talking to him, you know. Acting like he just made a mistake." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pinch of divided loyalties. "She wants to believe her father isn't cruel," I said quietly. "Let her have that for now." After the call, I sat at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at the steam curling upward. I realized I was no longer thinking only of what he had done. I was thinking of what I had allowed. I had excused the silences, forgiven the absences, convinced myself love meant endurance. But endurance had only made me invisible. That afternoon, I walked downtown to the coffee shop, hoping the noise would drown my thoughts. I sat in a corner booth, cradling a paper cup between my palms. Then I heard his voice. It was unmistakable, deep, and confident, carrying across the room. He sat 2 tables away, speaking to a man I recognized vaguely from the bank. I froze, breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to hear him, but I couldn't stop listening. Best decision I ever made, he said, his tone casual, almost jovial. She never saw it coming. Dropped the papers right on the table. Merry Christmas, huh? They both laughed. My stomach churned. His cruelty wasn't just in the act, but in the pride he took in it. It wasn't a painful necessity for him. It was a performance. He wanted an audience. The man asked, "You think she'll fight it? Fight Eleanor." My husband chuckled. "She won't make a scene. She never has. That's the beauty of it. She'll take what I give her." My hands shook so badly I spilled coffee onto the table. I grabbed a napkin, pressing it down hard, but the burn wasn't from the liquid, it was from his words. She won't fight. I sat there for another minute, waiting for my legs to steady. Then I stood and walked out, the cold air slapping my face. My chest heaved as though I had been running. The humiliation at Christmas had been unbearable, but this was something sharper. This was clarity. He had built his entire plan on the belief that I would remain silent, compliant, invisible. He mistook endurance for weakness. I walked home with snow crunching under my boots, my pulse pounding in my ears. The betrayal was no longer just about papers or a ruined holiday. It was about the decades he had relied on my silence. And the thought struck me like lightning. I didn't have to be silent anymore. That night, I pulled the envelope from the mantel and spread the papers out on the kitchen table. The words blurred, but I forced myself to read. For the first time, I didn't see them as a sentence. I saw them as a weapon, his yes, but also mine. Each clause, each line was a battlefield, and I could choose to fight. I didn't know yet how. But I knew this: the Eleanor he mocked at that coffee shop no longer existed. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. It was the kind of space designed to make clients feel calm, but my hands still trembled as I signed my name on the visitor log. The receptionist smiled politely, offered me water, and motioned for me to sit. I smoothed my skirt, trying to steady myself. But inside my chest was a storm. 40 years of marriage had collapsed into this sterile waiting room with its framed diplomas and muted carpet. When the lawyer, a woman not much older than my daughter, entered, she shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the petition your husband filed." She slid a folder across the desk. "You have more power here than you realize." Her words startled me. For days I'd felt powerless, defined by that envelope. Yet here she was, telling me there was strength hidden in the very papers meant to ruin me. She explained equitable distribution, how our house, our savings, even his pension would be split. "You've contributed as much as he has," she said, her eyes steady on mine. "Your sacrifices count." I wanted to laugh at that, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like a foreign language. No one had ever said my sacrifices counted. Not him. Not even me. I swallowed hard and nodded. When I left her office, the winter sun blinded me. The city street buzzed with life cars, honking children tugging on their mothers' hands, people hurrying with bags of after-holiday returns. For the first time in weeks, I felt awake, as if the world had sharpened into focus. Back home, I spread the legal documents across the dining table once more. But now, Instead of seeing them as a declaration of defeat, I saw a map. Each clause, each term, each cold word could be navigated. I would not be silent. I would not be discarded. That night, my daughter came by with the grandchildren. She looked hesitant, her coat still on, eyes darting toward the mantel where the envelope still rested. "Dad says we should try to handle this without lawyers," she said. I met her gaze evenly. "Your father has already chosen his lawyer." "So have I." She flinched. "He said you'd drag this out, that you'd make it ugly." "Ugly?" My voice sharpened. "He humiliated me at my own table on Christmas Eve. He's already made it ugly." The children ran into the living room pulling at the last unopened gifts. My daughter's face softened, torn. "Mom, I just don't want to lose both of you." I wanted to reach for her to tell her I understood. Instead, I said quietly, "You won't. But you will see me different now. That's not something I can change." She left after an hour, leaving the children's laughter still echoing in the halls. The sound was both balm and wound. I leaned against the doorframe, realizing the family I had tried to preserve was already fractured beyond repair. And yet beneath the grief there was something else, dignity. The following week, I returned to the coffee shop where I had overheard him. This time, I sat with my head high, a notebook open in front of me. I began to write not poems like the ones in my youth, but lists. Lists of what I had endured, what I had given, what I had lost. Each line was proof evidence that my life was not invisible. Customers bustled around me, but I barely noticed. For the first time in decades, I was writing for myself. Later, when I came home, I placed the new notebook beside the old one on the mantel. Side by side, they looked like bookends to a life, the girl with dreams and the woman reclaiming them. One night, I couldn't sleep. I padded downstairs, wrapped in a shawl, and sat in the darkened living room. The Christmas tree still stood, though its needles had begun to fall. I left the lights off. Instead, I lit a single candle and watched its flame flicker against the window. The quiet was heavy, but not suffocating anymore. It was mine. I thought about the confrontation that would come, court dates, signatures, perhaps even bitter words exchanged across a polished table. The idea no longer terrified me. In fact, it steadied me. He had expected my silence. He had expected me to shrink. But I was learning that silence could hold strength too. The kind of silence that refuses to collapse, the kind that waits patient and unyielding until the right moment to speak. A week later, that moment came. I received a call from his attorney asking if I'd be willing to meet. I agreed. When the day arrived, I dressed carefully. Navy blazer, silver necklace, hair brushed until it gleamed. As I walked into the office, I felt every eye turn toward me. For once, I didn't shrink. He sat across the table, his expression smug at first, but when I slid the signed response papers toward him, his face shifted. He hadn't expected me to respond so quickly, so decisively. "This isn't what we agreed," he muttered, scanning the terms. "We didn't agree to anything," I said evenly. "You decided. I decide now." The silence stretched. His lawyer cleared his throat, beginning to explain, but I kept my eyes on him. My voice didn't tremble. My hands didn't shake. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the cold air. Snowflakes brushed against my cheeks, melting instantly. I lifted my chin, inhaling the crisp winter. Something inside me had shifted permanently. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was acting. That night back home, I returned the papers to their red envelope and set it gently on the mantel. It no longer looked like a weapon aimed at me. It looked like a symbol of survival, of quiet power reclaimed. The house was still too quiet, the family still divided, but I no longer feared the silence. I owned it. January stretched long and gray. Snow piled against the porch steps, turning the front yard into a frozen monument of silence. Inside the house felt cavernous, each room echoing with memories I couldn't quiet. But the papers on the mantel no longer frightened me. They had become part of the landscape, like a scar that aches but no longer bleeds. The family, though, was another wound altogether. My son called, often his voice sharp with anger. "Mom, he doesn't deserve a dime. You should take him for everything." He didn't understand that my fight wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. My daughter, meanwhile, drifted further away. When she spoke, her words were careful, rehearsed, as though she feared betraying one parent by comforting the other. One afternoon, she said quietly, "He told me, you'll ruin us all if you drag this out." The words cut deep. Ruin us all. As though my refusal to be silent was more destructive than his public betrayal. I wanted to argue, to demand her loyalty, but I bit down on the impulse. She needed time. Perhaps she needed to believe her father was still the man she once adored. I wouldn't take that from her, even if it meant she turned away from me. The quiet realization settled heavier each day. My marriage hadn't been a partnership in years. It had been a performance, and I was the stagehand, unseen and unthanked. The divorce papers didn't create the fracture. They exposed it. One evening, I sorted through old photo albums. My fingers brushed over glossy prints, birthdays, beach trips, graduations. In nearly every picture, I was at the edge of the frame, holding a cake, adjusting a child's collar, watching from the side. My husband stood at the center, smiling, receiving credit for a life I had labored to hold together. The albums felt less like memories and more like evidence of how thoroughly I had made myself invisible. I closed the books, my chest tight, but instead of despair, I felt a strange clarity. I had lived too long in the margins. That was over now. The next morning, I returned to the lawyer's office. She explained the process ahead: motions, disclosures, negotiations. "It may take months," she warned. "It may get ugly." I surprised myself by smiling. "It already is ugly," I said. "At least now it's honest." She nodded, then asked, "Do you want to push for mediation or court?" I said without hesitation. If he wanted privacy, he should have given me respect. He made this public. We'll keep it public. Her eyes softened, and for the first time I felt not just like a client, but like a woman finally being seen. Back home, I began clearing space in the house. Not for him, but for me. I boxed up his suits, his cufflinks, the colognes that still clung to the dresser. Each item carried years of memory, arguments, reconciliations, excuses, but I packed them with steady hands. I set the boxes by the door. He came that evening to collect them. His expression clipped his jaw tight. "You don't waste time, do you?" he muttered. I met his eyes. Not anymore. He didn't linger. He carried the boxes to his car, shut the trunk, and drove away. I watched the taillights fade down the street. For the first time in weeks, I breathed without heaviness pressing against my chest. Later that night, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, staring at the red envelope. My hands no longer trembled when I touched it. Instead, I opened it again, running my fingers over the cold legal text. This was not just a document of ending. It was proof that I had survived, that I was still here. And then something shifted. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt spacious, mine to fill however I chose. I lit another candle, letting its flame dance across the walls. The room glowed softly warm, despite the snow outside. I whispered into the stillness, "I am not ruined." The words surprised me. They felt truer than anything I'd said in months. In the weeks that followed, I began to rediscover rhythms of my own making. I joined a book club at the library where women my age gathered with paperbacks and laughter. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, my fingers trembling over the brush at first, then steadying as colors spread across the canvas. I even began journaling again, each entry a thread, tying me back to the girl I once was. My daughter visited one afternoon, the grandchildren in tow. She lingered in the doorway, her eyes scanning the mantel, the notebook stacked beside the envelope. "You look different," she said softly. "I am," I replied. She nodded, though her eyes were wet. We didn't speak more of it, but something eased between us. She saw that I wasn't broken. Maybe she even saw that strength didn't mean ruining the family. It meant refusing to vanish from it. But even as small sparks of life returned, I knew the confrontation with him still loomed. Court dates, negotiations, the formal unraveling of decades. The thought didn't paralyze me anymore. It focused me. He believed humiliation would silence me. Instead, it had sharpened me into something I didn't know I could be. One evening, as snow fell outside, I stood by the window and whispered a truth I had been circling for weeks. He underestimated me. The words felt like an incantation, a promise to myself. I didn't yet know how the next chapters would unfold. But I knew this: I would no longer be the woman in the margins of family photos. I would no longer be the silent stagehand. The red envelope had been his weapon, but it had become my key. By February, the snow was beginning to melt, turning the sidewalks into slush. The days were longer, but my nights remained stretched and restless. I often woke in the dark, listening to the creaks of the old house, remembering how he used to snore beside me. I didn't miss the sound. I missed the illusion it had once given me that we were together, that marriage meant I wasn't alone. One morning, I walked downtown for groceries. The streets glistened with thawing ice, shop windows cluttered with red hearts for Valentine's Day. I passed a florist displaying roses wrapped in cellophane. For years, I had bought my own flowers, arranging them in vases as though they were gifts from him. It had been easier than waiting for something that never came. That morning, I didn't stop. I didn't buy any roses. I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. At the store, I turned into the coffee aisle and nearly collided with an old acquaintance, Margaret, a friend from church I hadn't seen in months. She clutched her cart tightly when she saw me, her smile hesitant. "Eleanor?" she said carefully. I wasn't sure if I should say anything. Her hesitation told me everything before she spoke. "My husband had been talking. He's been open," she continued. "At choir practice, he mentioned you were being difficult, that you'd lost touch with reality." Her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know." I thanked her, my voice steady though my stomach churned. He wasn't content with humiliating me at Christmas. He was rewriting the story of our life, painting me as unstable, ungrateful, bitter. It was easier for him to play the victim than admit the cruelty of what he'd done. When I got home, I sat at the table and opened my notebook. I wrote the words exactly as Margaret had said them, lost touch with reality. I stared at the phrase until the letters blurred. Then I wrote beneath it, "No, I am seeing clearly for the first time." The next week, I discovered something worse. Sorting through a pile of mail, I found a statement from our joint account. Large withdrawals had been made, hotel charges, restaurants' expenses I hadn't authorized. My chest tightened. These weren't recent. They stretched back months, maybe years. I sat frozen, the numbers glaring up at me. He hadn't just abandoned me. He had been living another life while I tended the hearth. I carried the statement to my lawyer. She skimmed it quickly, her eyes narrowing. These expenses are marital property. If he spent money on someone else, that matters. We can subpoena records. The word someone else burned through me. I had suspected, of course, late-night secret phone calls, the strange perfume on his shirts. But suspicion was easy to dismiss when you wanted peace. Now, staring at the proof in black and white, I felt a strange calm. Betrayal wasn't just an idea anymore. It was documented, printed, undeniable. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks open, the yellowed one from my youth, the new one filled with angry entries. Between them lay the bank statement, my past, my present, and the undeniable truth of my marriage. I realized I had a choice. I could drown in humiliation, or I could build something out of it. 2 days later, my lawyer scheduled mediation. I walked into the conference room wearing the navy blazer I had begun to think of as armor. He was already there, sitting with his attorney. He didn't look at me. Instead, he flipped through papers, tapping his pen like he was bored. The mediator began with neutral words about fairness and compromise. His lawyer spoke of reasonable settlements. Then it was my turn. I slid the bank statement across the table. His eyes flicked down, and for the first time, I saw his mask falter. You withdrew marital funds for personal expenses, my lawyer said evenly. We'll need full disclosure of all accounts. If not, we'll take it to court. His jaw clenched. He glanced at me, then his eyes, dark sharp. For years, I had looked away from that stare. This time, I held it. I didn't blink. The mediator cleared his throat, trying to smooth the tension, but the damage was done. He knew I wasn't the silent partner anymore. When the session ended, I walked out into the crisp winter air, my breath visible. I felt taller, steadier, as though I had finally stepped into my own skin. I wasn't the woman he mocked at coffee shops or choir practices. I wasn't the ghost at the edge of family photos. I was the woman who had evidence, who had a voice, who had the will to fight. That night, I sat by the fire with a cup of tea. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I stared at the flame until my eyes blurred and whispered, "You underestimated me." The words no longer felt like a fragile hope. They felt like truth. The morning of the court hearing, I dressed as though I were preparing for battle. The navy blazer again pressed until the seams were crisp. My silver necklace simple but solid against my collarbone. I brushed my hair back, pinned it carefully, and looked in the mirror until I believed what I saw. Not a discarded wife, but a woman who had survived, who had sharpened her grief into something unbreakable. At the courthouse, the air smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. People bustled past in hushed tones, filing papers, carrying folders, rushing between rooms. I sat on a hard bench outside the courtroom, my lawyer beside me flipping through documents. The folder in her hands contained the bank statements, the account withdrawals, the hotel receipts. Evidence, she called it. To me, it was the story of a marriage stripped of its illusions. When he arrived, I felt the shift before I saw him. His presence still carried weight the same way a storm front does before rain. He wore a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression confident. For years, I had interpreted that confidence as strength. Now I recognized it for what it was, arrogance. He glanced at me quick and dismissive before whispering to his attorney. It was as if 40 years of my life were nothing more than a file on his desk. Inside the courtroom, the judge called the case. We rose, the room echoing with the shuffle of feet. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady as I held the folder. This was not the life I had chosen, but it was the life I would no longer hide from. The proceedings began. His lawyer spoke first, painting him as generous, insisting he wanted a fair settlement. When it was my turn, my lawyer rose calmly and laid the bank statements on the table. She spoke clearly, each word like a chisel breaking stone. Funds withdrawn for personal use. Multiple charges consistent with another household. This is not fairness. This is concealment. The judge's expression tightened. He asked questions, his tone sharp. My husband shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the papers and his attorney. For the first time, I saw a crack in his performance. When my lawyer finished, the room fell silent. The sound of the heating system hummed overhead. The judge leaned back, eyes scanning the documents. Then he spoke. Mr. Thompson, you'll provide full disclosure of all accounts within 30 days. Failure to do so will result in sanctions. I exhaled, the breath trembling out of me. Not victory, not yet, but recognition. Someone in authority had looked at the truth and spoken it aloud. Afterward, in the hallway, he approached me. His voice was low, meant only for me. You don't know what you're doing, Eleanor. You'll regret this. I met his gaze. The only thing I regret is wasting so much of my life believing you. His eyes flickered anger, disbelief, maybe even fear. He turned abruptly and walked away, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. That night, I returned home exhausted. The house was dark, the silence heavy, but for once, it didn't feel empty. I set the court papers on the table, lit a candle, and sat quietly. My hands shook, but not from fear, from release. I had faced him, faced the law, faced myself, and I was still standing. Days passed, each one carrying its own rhythm. I began to notice the small things again, the way morning light streamed through the curtains, the sound of the kettle whistling, the comfort of writing in my notebook each night. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was no longer defined by his betrayal. I was beginning to define myself. One evening, my son stopped by. He dropped into a chair, his expression tired but proud. Mom, he said, I'm glad you fought back. I was scared you'd let him walk over you. I smiled faintly. So was he. My son reached across the table, squeezing my hand. His grip was warm, grounding. For the first time, I felt like my fight wasn't just for me. It was for my children, too. To show them that silence isn't strength, that dignity means speaking, even when your voice shakes. The following week, I attended my painting class again. My brush moved more confidently, colors blending into shapes that made sense only to me. The instructor paused at my easel, studying the strokes. There's a strength in this, she said softly. I didn't explain. I simply nodded because I knew she was right. At home, I hung the painting on the wall above the mantel. The notebooks, the envelope, and now this painting, all symbols of my survival. The envelope that once broke me now sat quietly, its power spent. The painting, fresh and alive, belonged to me. Late one night, I sat by the fire, the glow warming my face. I whispered aloud, I am not the woman you thought I was. The words filled the room, bouncing off the walls, settling into my chest. For the first time, I believed them. The day of the second court session arrived with a biting wind that cut through my coat as I walked up the courthouse steps. The sky was steel gray, heavy with the promise of snow. I gripped the handrail, steadying myself, but my heart no longer pounded like it had the first time. The fear was there, yes, but it was threaded with something else: resolve. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing the hallway in a dull glow. I spotted him immediately. He stood with his attorney, his posture stiff, his mouth drawn into the same thin line I'd memorized over decades of marriage. Once that line had meant disapproval of me, burning dinner, of me spending too much at the store, of me asking questions he didn't want to answer. Now it looked brittle, as though one wrong word might crack it open. My lawyer leaned close. Today is about negotiation. He may push hard, but you don't have to concede anything. Remember, you hold equal ground. Equal ground. The phrase echoed in my head as we entered the conference room. For so many years, our marriage had been tilted in his favor, my sacrifices sliding unnoticed into the cracks. Equal ground felt foreign, but I was ready to claim it. The mediator began with pleasantries, then asked each side to present their proposals. His lawyer slid a stack of papers across the table. Mr. Thompson is offering the house in exchange for full rights to the pension. He believes this is fair, given his decades of employment. I almost laughed. His decades of employment, as though mine hadn't been spent ironing shirts, managing moves, raising children alone, while he climbed the ladder. My lawyer cleared her throat, calm and steady. Mrs. Thompson is entitled to half of the pension. The house alone does not represent her full contribution. He shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, he spoke directly to me. Eleanor, do you really want to drag this out? Think about the family. Think about the grandchildren. I met his gaze. I am thinking about them. I'm thinking about what kind of example I set if I let you erase me. The room went quiet. His lawyer coughed, shuffling papers, but the words hung heavy, undeniable. We broke for lunch. I stepped outside, the cold air rushing into my lungs. Snowflakes drifted lazily, landing on my coat, dissolving into nothing. I leaned against the stone wall, watching my breath rise in clouds. For the first time, I felt taller than the courthouse itself. When we reconvened, my lawyer placed another document on the table, my signed response. My counter-signature stood bold beside his. Mrs. Thompson will not agree to less than her lawful share, she said, and she is prepared to take this through trial if necessary. He picked up the paper, scanning my signature. His face faltered just slightly, but enough for me to see it. He hadn't expected this. He still believed the narrative he spun at coffee shops and choir practices, that I was meek, malleable, unwilling to fight. He believed the Eleanor he had known for 40 years still lived here. He was wrong. You won't win, he muttered, his voice low, almost a growl. I leaned forward, my own voice steady. Winning isn't the point. Being seen is. For a moment, the years peeled away, the dinners where I swallowed my words, the nights I turned over in bed, pretending not to feel his absence, the mornings I made coffee while he read the paper in silence. All the times I chose endurance over confrontation. And now, here I was, confronting him in the only way that mattered. The mediator eventually wrapped things up, scheduling another session. Nothing was finalized, but something more important had shifted. The balance of power had changed. He could no longer count on my silence. Afterward, I walked out into the snow. My son was waiting by the curb, his car engine idling. How'd it go? He asked. I slid into the passenger seat, brushing snow from my shoulders. He knows now, I said simply. Knows what? That I'm not afraid of him. My son glanced at me, pride softening his features. He didn't press for details. He didn't need to. That evening back home, I brewed tea and sat at the mantel. The red envelope still rested there, edges curled from handling. I picked it up, turning it in my hands. Once it had been a symbol of humiliation, of the end of everything I thought I was. Tonight, it felt different. A reminder not of loss, but of the moment I began to reclaim myself. I slid the envelope into a drawer, no longer needing it displayed as a talisman. In its place, I set the painting from my class, a burst of deep blues and sharp golds, colors clashing and blending until they formed something jagged but beautiful. My life in color. My proof that endings could become beginnings. Later, I wrote in my notebook, "Today I met his eyes and did not look away. Today I signed my name beside his, not as his wife, but as myself." The words steadied me. They were more than record. They were declaration. When I blew out the candle and climbed the stairs to bed, I didn't glance back at the mantel. I didn't need to. The image of that painting bright against the wall glowed in my mind. A beacon, a promise. A week after the hearing, the phone rang late in the evening. I was rinsing dishes, the warm water soft against my cold hands. When I saw my daughter's name on the screen, my chest tightened. I dried my hands, quickly answered, and braced myself. Her voice came sharp, clipped. "Mom, what are you doing?" I hesitated. "I don't know what you mean. I mean, dragging Dad through court like this. He says you're demanding everything, that you're trying to ruin him. Do you know what this is doing to the family?" The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I sank into a chair, phone pressed tight against my ear. "Sweetheart, I'm not ruining anything. I'm asking for what's mine, for what I've earned." She let out a frustrated sigh. "You've always had the house, the kids, everything. He worked his whole life for that pension. Don't you think you're being selfish?" Selfish. I closed my eyes, feeling the heat rise in my chest. I thought of the sleepless nights with fevers, the years of moves, the meals stretched to feed 4 on a budget meant for 2, the dreams tucked into boxes I never reopened. Selfish was a word I had never allowed myself. Until now. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not selfish. I'm finally not invisible." Silence stretched on the line. I imagined her chewing her lip, torn between love for her father and loyalty to me. "Mom," she whispered at last, "you're tearing us apart." Her words cracked something inside me. I wanted to scream. He tore us apart when he handed me divorce papers at the Christmas table. But instead, I said quietly, "No, darling, he did that. I'm just trying to survive." She hung up soon after. Her goodbye rushed and brittle. I sat in the dim kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The loneliness pressed down heavier than any snowstorm. For decades, I had sacrificed for family, and now my own child looked at me as the destroyer. The next morning, my son stopped by unannounced. He stormed in, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "She called me," he said without preamble. "Said you two fought." I sighed. She doesn't see it yet. She wants to believe her father's version of things. He slammed his fist lightly against the counter. It makes me sick the way he twists everything. "But you can't back down, Mom. You hear me? Don't you dare back down." I smiled faintly, the corners of my lips trembling. "I won't. I promised." Still, when he left, I stood by the window, watching his car disappear. My reflection stared back, lined, weary, but unbroken. And yet, my daughter's words echoed selfish, tearing us apart. That night, I dreamed of the Christmas table again. The envelope sliding across the polished wood, the silence that followed the fracture, spreading like a crack in glass. But this time in the dream, I didn't drop my fork. I stood, took the papers, and handed them back. "No," I said in the dream, "not like this." I woke with my heart racing, sweat dampening my neck, and realized I was rehearsing for a confrontation still to come. A few days later, my lawyer called with updates. "He's stalling," she said, dragging his feet on disclosures. "We'll file a motion if we need to." I nodded into the phone, though she couldn't see me. Stalling was his specialty. Delay, deflect, distract. It was how he had managed our marriage, too, always promising to talk later to change, later to love me later. Later had finally run out. That evening, I cooked myself dinner, a simple plate of pasta steam, curling upward like a benediction. I set the table for one, lit a candle, and ate slowly. For the first time, I didn't feel the emptiness of the other chairs. I felt presence my own. Afterward, I opened my notebook and wrote, "They think I am selfish. Maybe I am. But selfishness tastes like freedom after a lifetime of sacrifice." The next Sunday, I went to church alone. Whispers followed me down the aisle, pitying smiles, murmurs behind hymnals. I lifted my chin, slid into a pew, and sang anyway. My voice cracked at first, but then it grew stronger, weaving through the notes like a thread pulling fabric together. I didn't look at anyone else. I sang for myself. When I returned home, I placed the hymn sheet beside the painting on the mantel. My altar of survival grew, each item a testament: the notebooks, the painting, the hymn sheet. Proof that I was building a life brick by brick, even as the old one collapsed. That night, my daughter sent a text, "I don't understand you anymore." I typed back, "Maybe one day you will." Then I set the phone aside, turned off the light, and sat in the quiet. Her distance hurt, yes, but it no longer defined me. I whispered into the dark, "I am selfish, and I am alive." The words didn't feel like shame. They felt like victory. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it crept in, gently tiny buds, along the branches outside my kitchen window. Robins pecking at thawed ground. The snow had receded into gray patches at the edges of the yard. For months, my life had been consumed by hearings, papers, whispers, and accusations. Now, for the first time, the air smelled of possibility. At my lawyer's suggestion, I began therapy. Walking into the counselor's office felt strange, like stepping into a foreign country, where emotions had their own language. The walls were lined with shelves of books, soft light filtering through sheer curtains. The woman who greeted me wore no jewelry, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she invited me to sit. "So, Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle but direct, "why are you here today?" The question caught me off guard. I had expected her to start with him, with the betrayal, the divorce, the humiliation. Instead, she wanted me to define the beginning. My throat tightened, and before I could stop myself, I said, "Because I don't know who I am without sacrifice." She didn't flinch. She nodded as though the words were familiar, as though she had heard them from many women before me. Then maybe she said softly, "This is where we start." Over the weeks, therapy became a mirror I hadn't dared to face. We spoke about the college degree. I never finished the poems I tucked away, the years I lived in the margins of photographs. We spoke about how endurance had become my only language, how silence had become my survival tool. And then she asked me something that unraveled me completely. When was the last time you did something only for yourself? I sat in silence, fumbling through decades, and realized I couldn't remember. Not truly. Even my painting class, my book club, it was all framed as rebuilding. But before I had nothing. One evening after a session, I came home, lit a candle, and sat at the kitchen table. The red envelope was still in the drawer out of sight, but never fully gone. I thought of the girl I had been at 20, the woman I had been at 40, and the 60-year-old I was now. I whispered into the flame, "You are still here." It felt clumsy, almost embarrassing, but it was the beginning of something I hadn't said in decades: recognition. I also began gardening again. It started with one small pot of tulips on the windowsill, their petals curling open like fragile hope. Soon, I found myself at the nursery filling my cart with soil herbs and flats of pansies. In the backyard, I dug into the earth, the dirt caking under my nails, the smell grounding me. Planting seeds felt like defiance proof that I believed in a future even if I didn't know its shape. Meanwhile, the divorce moved forward. His lawyer filed more motions trying to paint me as unreasonable. My daughter remained distant, sending only short texts about the grandchildren. My son checked in often, his frustration with his father growing sharper. But I no longer lived only in their responses. Therapy had taught me to claim my own center. Their choices mattered, but they no longer defined me. One afternoon, I sat in the therapist's office, and she asked, "What would healing look like to you?" I hesitated, then said, "It would look like a table set for dinner, where I'm not waiting for anyone else to arrive." She smiled. "Then maybe you should set that table." That night I did. I laid out my best dishes, polished silverware, a glass of wine. I cooked salmon with lemon-roasted vegetables and a small chocolate cake. I lit 2 candles, though only one was necessary, and sat down at the table alone. For the first time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence. I savored every bite, slowly letting the silence stretch. After dinner, I wrote in my notebook, "Tonight, I ate with myself, and I was good company." The words startled me with their truth. In the weeks that followed, my garden bloomed. Neighbors stopped by, curious about the sudden burst of color in the yard. I invited them in for coffee, and laughter filled the kitchen in a way it hadn't in years. It wasn't the same as family, it was different, but it was community chosen and genuine. My daughter came by once briefly. She stood on the porch, her children tugging at her coat. Her eyes flicked to the tulips, then to me. She looked tired, conflicted, but she said, "The garden's beautiful, Mom." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you." She didn't stay long, but the compliment lingered. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a thread. Maybe one day it would weave into something stronger. By late spring, the divorce case had stretched into routine hearings, filings waiting. But I was no longer consumed by it. Therapy and the garden gave me anchors, places where my life was not measured in betrayal, but in growth. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, the garden glowing in golden light. I thought of Christmas Eve, of the envelope sliding across the table, of the humiliation that once defined me. Now it felt like a distant storm, terrible, unforgettable, but survived. I whispered into the dusk, "I am not what you tried to make me." The words floated into the air, soft but certain. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a warm glow. I sat there until the stars appeared, the night settling gently around me. and for the first time since the papers arrived, I felt something close to peace. By December, the year had turned full circle. The air was sharp again, the sidewalks dusted with fresh snow houses glowing with twinkling lights. But my own house felt entirely different from the one that had witnessed its collapse 12 months earlier. The mantel no longer displayed the red envelope. It had been tucked away in a drawer, stripped of its power. In its place hung my painting bright strokes of blue and gold and a small wreath of evergreens from my own garden. This Christmas, I set the table differently. The long dining table that once groaned under the weight of roasts and casseroles now sat shortened leaves removed so it felt more intimate. I laid out 4 plates, 1 for me, 1 for my son, and 2 for my neighbors, a retired couple who had become dear to me during the spring. They had helped me haul bags of soil for my garden, shared coffee on lazy mornings, and filled silences with gentle conversation. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the air, mingling with cinnamon from the apple pie cooling on the counter. It wasn't the feast of years past, but it was enough, warm, hearty, honest. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window as I stirred the gravy. My face was lined, yes, but my eyes held a calm I hadn't seen before. When my son arrived, he hugged me tightly. "The place smells amazing," he said, stepping inside. His laughter filled the room as he helped carry dishes to the table. The neighbors soon followed, bringing a bottle of wine and a tray of cookies. Together, we sat passing plates, sharing stories. The house, once echoing with betrayal, now hummed with something softer, chosen company, mutual care. I couldn't help glancing at the empty chairs, the ones that once held my husband, my daughter, my grandchildren. The ache was still there. Absence never leaves entirely, but it didn't swallow me anymore. Instead, it sat quietly in the background, a reminder of what I had endured and survived. At one point, my neighbor raised her glass. To Eleanor, she said warmly, "For proving that strength doesn't always shout, it sometimes grows like flowers in the snow." Tears pricked my eyes, but I smiled, clinking my glass with theirs. "To survival," I added. After dinner, we lingered in the living room. The tree glowed in the corner, smaller than last year's, but decorated with care. I had strung popcorn garlands and hung ornaments I'd saved from decades past. Each one told a story, but now those stories belonged to me alone. My son knelt by the fire, coaxing the logs into a steady blaze, while the neighbors shared a story about their first Christmas as newlyweds in a tiny apartment. I listened, warmth spreading through me, realizing I didn't miss the chaos of a crowded holiday. I missed honesty, connection, laughter that wasn't forced. And now here it was. Different, yes, but real. Later, when the guests had gone and my son kissed me goodnight, I sat alone by the fire. The quiet settled around me, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of last year. It was peace. I thought back to that night, the envelope sliding across the table, the fork clattering, the shame that burned hotter than the candles. I remembered stepping outside into the snow, barefoot, clutching those papers as if they might consume me whole. I whispered into the flames, "You didn't end me." The fire crackled, sparks rising like tiny stars. Before bed, I opened my notebook. On the first page of the new volume, I wrote, "This year, I gave myself back to myself." I paused, then added, "And that is the greatest gift I have ever received." As I set down the pen, I thought of my daughter, of the grandchildren I hadn't seen in months. The ache returned, but it no longer hollowed me out. Relationships bend and break in ways we cannot always mend, but I knew the door to my home and my heart remained open. Not for him, not ever again, but for them, should they choose to walk through it. I climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at the window to look out at the snow. The neighborhood glowed with colored lights, wreaths on doors, carols drifting faintly through the night. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the cool seep into my skin, and whispered one last thought into the dark. I am still here. When I turned away, the reflection that followed me was no longer a shadow. It was a woman, whole scarred, but standing quiet, but unbroken. And for the first time in years, Christmas felt like mine.